Hello everyone. Today we'll be discussing about types of novels and their characteristics. As we read a novel, it'll be interesting to find out what kind of a novel it is and what are the characteristics that you will see when you read a novel. So let's move on to this session. In the initial part of this session, we'll be discussing about romances or romance novels. So what are these romances or romance novels? In the strictest academic terms, a romance is a narrative genre in literature that involves a mysterious, adventurous, or spiritual storyline where the focus is on a quest that involves bravery and strong values, not always a love interest. However, modern definitions of romance also include stories that have a relationship issue as the main focus. In the academic sense, an example of a romance is a story in which the main character is a hero who must conquer various challenges as part of a quest. Each challenge could be its own story and can be taken out of the overall story without harming the plot. A modern romance would include the story of a character who keeps meeting the wrong type of people in his or her relationships or has run into a problem with a current love relationship. The story would focus on the struggles the character faces while finding Mr. or Mrs. Right. The whole focus would be the relationship, although the character may also be dealing with other struggles such as losing a job, handling difficult parents, etc. These stories may be funny, sad, tragic, serious, or a mix. The obvious resolution to the conflict would be finding the right person or saving the present relationship. Let us move on to another genre, Picaresque Novel. A Picaresque novel is an early form of novel, usually in first-person narrative, relating the adventures of a rogue or low-born adventurer. In Spanish it is picaro, as he drifts from place to place and from one social milieu to another in his effort to survive. The genre comes to existence during a historical context where Spain is going through tremendous chaos. There were upheavals regarding the monarchy, the church, the feudal system, foreign populations, and even in the arts. The world as Spain knew it at the time was crumbling around, and as a result, there was hunger, anger, chaos, and overall social dysfunction. The picaresque became the comic relief of the times. The main character of picaresque novels is meant to represent a typical citizen who also happens to live in oblivion of the chaos surrounding him. Although the character is oblivious, at the same time it suffers as a result of the circumstances. This main character is either young, ignorant, or a simpleton. A classic example is El Lazarillo de Thomas, who is a picaro, a rascal, mischievous man, a little boy living in extreme poverty, but who uses his wits to score at least a piece of bread. Hunger and conflict are perennial themes in picaresque novels, and poverty, corruption, and injustice are ever present. It is safe to say that these novels provided a much needed way of escapism from the unfair situation of the common folk by using as a mouthpiece the wits and malice of an everyday character who speaks on behalf of those who live in equally miserable circumstances. Examples include Henry Fielding's The History of Tom Jones, Sentimental Novel. So this is another genre in which an emotionally extravagant novel of a kind that became popular in Europe in the late 18th century. It is partly inspired by the emotional power of Samuel Richardson's Pamela or Virtue Rewarded, which came out in 1740, The sentimental novels of the 1760s and 1770s exhibit the close connections between virtue and sensibility in repeatedly tearful scenes. A character's feeling for the beauties of nature and for the griefs of others is taken as a sign of a pure heart. An excessively sentimental example is Henry Mackenzie's The Man of Feeling, which came out in 1771. But Oliver Goldsmith's The Vicar of Wakefield, which came out in 1766, and Laurence Sterne's A Sentimental Journey in 1768 are more ironic in nature. In Europe, the most important sentimental novels were J.J. Rousseau's La Nouvelle Heloise in 1761 and J.W. Vaughan Guide's The Sorrows of Young Werther, which came out in 1774. Next genre is Epistolary Novel. An epistolary novel is a novel written as a series of documents. The usual form is letters, although diary entries, newspaper clippings, and other documents are sometimes used. Recently, electronic documents such as recordings and radio, blogs and emails have also come into use. Novels written in an epistolary format are often less dialogue driven, with more emphasis on thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Instead of being in the action with the protagonist, most scenes are filtered through the character and presented as memories. Examples include Bram Stoker's late 19th century novel Dracula. It's a famous example of epistolary writing, as he includes letters, ship logs, telegrams, doctor's notes, and diary entries. This is a polylogic form of an epistolary novel. Next genre is historical novel. Historical novel is a novel that has as its setting a period of history and that attempts to convey the spirit, manners, and social conditions of a past age with realistic detail and fidelity, which in some cases only apparent fidelity to historical fact. The work may deal with actual historical personages, as does Robert Graves' Le Claudius, which came out in 1934, or it may contain a mixture of fictional and historical characters. It may focus on a single historic event, as does Franz Werfel's 40 Days of Musa-Dag, which came out in 1934, which dramatizes the defense of an Armenian stronghold. More often, it attempts to portray a broader view of a past society in which great events are reflected by their impact on the private lives of fictional individuals. Since the appearance of the first historical novel, Sir Walter Scott's Waverley, which came out in 1814, this type of fiction has remained popular. Though some historical novels such as Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, which came out in between 1865 and 69, are of the highest artistic quality, many of them are written to mediocre standards. Next genre is science fiction. What is science fiction? Science fiction, abbreviated as SF or sci-fi, is a form of fiction that deals principally with the impact of actual or imagined science upon society or individuals. The term science fiction was popularized, if not invented, in the 1920s by one of the genre's principal advocates, the American publisher Hugo Gernsback. The Hugo Awards, given annually since 1953 by the World Science Fiction Society, are named after him. These achievement awards are given to the top science fiction writers, editors, illustrators, films, and fans. Examples include The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, Frankenstein or The Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley, 1984 by George Orwell, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells again. A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine Engel. Next genre is detective fiction. Detective fiction is a subgenre of crime fiction and mystery fiction in which an investigator or a detective, either professional, amateur or retired, investigates a crime, often murder. The detective genre began around the same time as speculative fiction or other genre fiction in the mid-19th century and has remained extremely popular, particularly in novels. Some of the most famous heroes of detective fiction include Auguste Dupin, Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot. Juvenile stories featuring the Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew and the Boxcar Children have also remained in print for several decades. The traditional elements of the detective stories are: number 1, the seemingly perfect crime; number 2, the wrongly accused suspect at whom circumstantial evidence points; number 3, the bungling of dim-witted police; and number 4, the greater powers of observation and superior mind of the detective; and 5, the startling and unexpected denouement in which the detective reveals how the identity of the culprit was asserted. Detective stories frequently operate on the principle that superficially convincing evidence is ultimately irrelevant. Usually, it is also axiomatic that the clues from which a logical solution to the problem can be reached fairly presented to the reader at exactly the same time that the detective receives them, and that the detective deduces the solution to the puzzle from a logical interpretation of these clues. The French author Émile Gaboureau's L'Affaire Rouge, which came out in 1866, was an enormously successful novel that had several sequels. Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone, which came out in 1868, remains one of the finest English detective novels. Anna Catherine Green became one of the first American detective novelists with The Leavenworth Case, which came out in 1878. The Mystery of Hansom Cab, 1886, by the Australian Fergus Hume, was a phenomenal commercial success. Next genre is utopian fiction. Utopian fiction is a style of fiction that takes place in an idealized world. The author of a utopian novel sets their narrative in a world that aligns with their broader ethos and personal philosophy. This does not mean that utopian works are free from conflict. The same core elements of fiction, that is compelling storytelling, a well-developed main character, and problems that must be solved, apply to utopian literature as well. The difference is that utopian novels are often set in a perfect society or ideal state. The injection of conflict into an ideal society may seem antithetical, but as utopian authors demonstrate, human beings have a knack for creating conflict if given enough time. The term utopia was invented by the English philosopher Sir Thomas More, recalling ancient Greek words meaning good place and no place. More's book Utopia, which was published in 1516, describes an ideal utopian society, and his vision has ever since served as a touchstone for philosophers, public servants, and fiction writers alike. To this day, utopian studies is offered in philosophy departments at major universities. Examples include A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells, Men Like Gods by H.G. Wells again, Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, Ireland by Aldous Huxley, Always Coming Home by Ursula K. Le Guin, Walden 2 by B.F. Skinner, the Star Trek science fiction television series created by Gene Roddenberry, Next genre, dystopian fiction. Dystopian literature is a form of speculative fiction that began as a response to utopian literature. A dystopia is an imagined community or society that is dehumanizing and frightening. A dystopia is an antonym for utopia, which is a perfect society. The term utopia was coined by Sir Thomas More in his 1516 book Utopia, which was about an ideal society on a fictional island. Unlike utopian literature, dystopian literature explores the dangerous effects of political and social structures on humanity's future. Dystopian fiction can be a way to educate and warn humanity about the dangers of current social and political structures. Margaret Atwood's 1985 novel, The Handmaid's Tale, takes place in a futuristic United States known as Gilead. It cautions against oppressive patriarchy. Dystopian stories may convey an author's beliefs. For example, H.G. Wells' 1895 novel, The Time Machine, reflected Wells' socialist views. The story follows a Victorian England scientist who builds a time machine and witnesses the pitfalls of a capitalist society. Dystopian stories require a greater suspension of disbelief and can be very imaginative. For example, George Orwell's allegory, Animal Farm, is about a group of pigs who stage a rebellion against their human farmer. The farm animals' rise to power is based on the Russian Revolution. Dystopian novels can also be satirical critiques. For example, the 1962 novel A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess is a social satire of behaviorism. It takes place in a futuristic society with a youth subculture of extreme violence. A totalitarian government protects society by prescribing good behavior and abolishing violent impulses. Next genre is Bildungsroman. This type of genre is also known as a coming-of-age story. A Bildungsroman is a tale in which the main character transforms from child to adult, or at least takes some major steps in that direction. Typically, a Bildungsroman follows some kind of growth or education. The character doesn't just grow up on her own, but has to go through a difficult experience in order to come out the other side with greater strength and wisdom. Every culture has its coming-of-age stories, and it's easy to see why. The transformation from child to adult is something that people experience in every culture in some way. And any reader can relate to a Bildungsroman because adolescence is one of the defining experiences of everyone's life. Children look ahead to what they will be when they grow up, and adults look back on the experiences that made them who they are today. So people of all ages can understand the story. Of course, the Bildungsroman is especially popular with teenagers who are all undergoing their own coming-of-age challenges. Examples include the Harry Potter series covers Harry's life from ages 11 to 17, so they are all about his growth and education. From a sad, lonely child at the beginning of the Sorcerer's Stone, he gradually changes and develops into a full-fledged wizard. Charles Dickens' David Copperfield, is definitely a Bildungsroman. The story covers young David's experiences from childhood into maturity as he learns about discipline, perseverance, independence, and love. Next genre of importance is Gothic Novel. This is also known as a novel of terror. It came out in the 18th century and also known as a pre-romantic novel. Strangeness and mystery of Middle Ages, sentimentalism of religion, ghosts, witches, graveyards, gloomy places, dark palaces comprise the theme of these type of novels. Examples include Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, Charlotte Smith's The Orphan of the Castle, The Recluse, Mrs. Radcliffe's The Romance of the Forest, etc. Next genre is domestic novel. Now, these novels portray domestic problems of human life, came out in the late 18th century and mostly focuses on the life of unmarried women. This has also themes on the period of marriageable age and also talks about common people of the common society. Love, marriage are ironically presented. Example, Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice are examples. Realistic novel. Now, in these kind of novels, the realistic problems of the society are portrayed. They see and represent things as they really are. Fielding, Jane Austen, W.M. Thackeray, Samuel Butler are examples who followed these type of genre. Next genre is psychological novel. This novel is also known as the stream of consciousness novel. It came out in the 20th century and it involves regular movements of thoughts, emotions and feelings. It was first coined by William James in his book Principles of Psychology, and it depicts the chaotic flow of impressions and sensations through the human consciousness. Proust, James Joyce, Dorothy Miller Richardson, Virginia Woolf are examples who followed this type of genre. Next important genre is regional novel. Now, this novel explains a particular region. It is presented as the subject of the novel and it is generally realistic. Life of rural areas and small towns are included. For example, Thomas Hardy includes Wessex as the region. The Bronte sisters focuses on Yorkshire moors. George Eliot focuses on Warwickshire and Derbyshire, and Sir Walter Scott on Waverley. Next genre is creative novel. Now, creative writing is any writing that goes outside the bounds of normal, professional, journalistic, academic or technical forms of literature, typically identified by an emphasis on narrative craft, character development and the use of literary tropes, or with various traditions of poetry and poetics. Due to the looseness of the definition, it is possible for writing such as feature stories to be considered creative writing, even though they fall under journalism, because the content of features is specifically focused on narrative and character development. Both fictional and non-fictional works fall into this category, including such forms as novels, biographies, short stories and poems. In the academic setting, creative writing is typically separated into fiction and poetry classes, with a focus on writing in an original style as opposed to imitating pre-existing genres such as crime or horror. Writing for the screen and stage, screenwriting and playwriting are often taught separately, but fit under the creative writing category as well. Creative writing can technically be considered any writing of original composition. In this sense, creative writing is a more contemporary and process-oriented name for what has been traditionally called literature, including the variety of its genres. Thank you all.